I'm Clark Aurora Mountain, and the year my world split into before and after hit me the moment I turned 13. If you asked me to pinpoint the exact second my parents decided, I was background scenery in my own life. It wasn't some slow realization, it was a note, slapped on the fridge like it didn't matter. Stay at a friend's back in a week. Love you. No signature, no explanation, just my mother's graceful handwriting which somehow read like indifference. That morning they were gone, Florida-bound, leaving me behind. My older sister, Jasmine Mountain, posted a picture of herself smiling, with her pink suitcase, and some cheery caption about family time, while little Lily added her palm tree emojis like everything was normal. I sat on the porch, backpack balanced on my knees, convinced someone, an aunt, a neighbor, even luck itself would show up. But no one did. The streetlights flickered on, and a dog barked at me like I didn't belong there. I made a burrito I didn't even like and ate it at the counter, pretending the microwave's hum counted as conversation. By the second day, I kept telling myself it was a mistake. By the fourth, another thought started whispering in my head, one I didn't want to acknowledge. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. Being the middle child had always meant being the quiet bridge between the star and the finale. Jasmine collected awards, varsity letters, everything that drew attention. Lily had dance recitals, braces, parties with color-matched cupcakes. I had responsible, which adults always use to mean unseen, but being abandoned on purpose introduced a silence I had never known before. 6 days in, I left the library carrying a fortress of borrowed books, stacked high enough to feel like armor. The heat shimmered so hard it blurred even my shadow. That's when a glossy black car slowed to the curb, windows rolling down like it belonged to someone else's life. "Clark?" a voice called. I half recognized it. Uncle Richard, the wealthy one who'd long opted out of family holidays before I could even count double digits. Mom always called him conceited, which I now understood meant he kept his boundaries. His eyes scanned my sweat-stuck hair, my tight-lipped smile, my backpack, and for a second, I felt seen. "Why are you out here alone? Where are your parents?" "Florida," I said, the word tasting absurd like they had gone to another planet. He muttered under his breath, something I wasn't meant to hear, and then said, "Get in. You're not walking anywhere tonight." Every warning I'd ever heard about strangers clanged through my head, but hunger spoke louder than fear. 3 nights of instant noodles, 1 of dry cereal. It was enough to convince me. The car smelled like leather and something sharp, a scent that wasn't perfume or citrus, just money that hadn't yet gone stale. He drove us to a diner with cracked red booths and pies trapped under glass domes. When the burger and milkshake came, I stared at them as if they might vanish if I blinked. He didn't push me to talk. He let me eat first, then asked about school, about friends. And for the first time that week, I realized someone wanted to hear my answers, not just glance past me. It wasn't sympathy, it wasn't pity. It was interest, a curiosity that made the silence, that had been crushing me for nearly a week, feel suddenly negotiable. Before I continue, tell, from which place are you watching this story right now? Please subscribe and like the video for motivation. The ride to Uncle Richard's place felt unreal, like I'd crossed into someone else's life while the old one was still burning behind me. I watched the city blur past the windows, my knuckles white around the straps of my backpack. Every so often, I caught my reflection in the glass, a 13-year-old kid in too big clothes, hair sticking up from sweat and worry, eyes that had learned to fold themselves down so no one could see the edges of fear. Uncle Richard didn't speak much, just drove with that quiet confidence that made it clear he ran his world with invisible rules I wasn't yet allowed to understand. The silence wasn't awkward, though it was something else, a waiting that felt like an invitation instead of a trap. When we arrived at his house, my jaw almost unhinged itself at the size. Marble floors, bookshelves that climbed the walls like towers, and the kind of furniture I'd only seen in magazines or on TV. For a second, I thought maybe I had wandered into a dream, and that at any moment, I'd wake up on my porch with my sad little burrito still in the microwave. Uncle Richard's eyes studied me as he gestured toward the staircase. "Your room's upstairs. Unpack if you like. I'll be downstairs if you want dinner later." He didn't hover, didn't fuss. He gave me space, but in a way that said he expected me to belong here, even if I didn't yet believe it myself. I wandered into the room, tracing my fingers along the smooth wood of the desk, the soft sheets on the bed, the window that opened onto a garden that smelled like spring even in the late summer heat. For the first time in nearly a week, I let my shoulders drop. The anxiety that had been tight in my chest loosened just enough for exhaustion to creep in. I unpacked slowly, stacking my books neatly on the shelves as if arranging them would somehow rearrange the chaos in my life. Dinner was quiet but comfortable. Uncle Richard didn't ask about my parents again, and I didn't offer. He spoke instead about the city, about school, about his own childhood, a thread of stories that were rich but never bragged about, never heavy. He had a way of making ordinary things feel significant. I listened, absorbing every word, realizing that this man who had once been just a name and a rumor in family gossip was the first adult who didn't treat me like a nuisance or a shadow. That night, lying in the bed that was far too big for me but still warm, I stared at the ceiling and let myself think. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was 13, abandoned by the people who should have mattered most, thrust into a life of privilege I didn't understand with a man I barely knew. And yet beneath the fear, there was a spark, a fragile, trembling belief that maybe this could be a new beginning. Hunger, exhaustion, loneliness, they'd shaped me into someone careful, cautious but also observant. And now I realized, someone was giving me a chance to be more than just the quiet middle. Child sleep came fitfully. Every creak of the house, every passing car outside made me flinch. But for the first time, I wasn't alone. Uncle Richard's presence was a quiet shield, invisible but solid. And as I drifted, I promised myself I would pay attention. I would learn the rules of this new life, watch the patterns, and find my place. I wasn't sure if I belonged yet, but I could already feel that this was the first time I had a shot at more than survival. I had a shot at something like a home. The first few days at Uncle Richard's house were like stepping into a world where every object seemed to have a story I wasn't allowed to touch yet, and every sound reminded me that this was real. Morning started quietly. Uncle Richard would already be in the study, papers spread before him, the faint scent of coffee curling in the air. I kept to my room at first, hesitant to intrude, afraid that any mistake would undo the fragile sense of safety I'd begun to feel. But hunger and curiosity always won. Breakfasts were silent meals of fresh fruit, eggs, and toast, not the instant chaos of my old kitchen, not the empty echoes of microwave meals alone, but he never forced conversation. He let the space between us be a bridge, not a wall, and I noticed the difference immediately. School was another challenge. I hadn't expected to be enrolled so quickly, and the idea of sitting among kids who had their parents waiting in the parking lot made my chest tighten. I carried my books like armor, watching everyone, learning their patterns, letting no one see how out of place I felt. But Uncle Richard had given me more than just a home. He had given me confidence in subtle ways. "Go," he said simply the first morning. "You'll figure it out." And I did, slowly. I learned who to trust, who to avoid, how to fold my awkwardness into something less visible. At lunch, I even found myself laughing at a joke, a small sound that surprised me with its own presence. Evenings were when the house felt most like a home. Uncle Richard would come find me after homework, sometimes to check on progress, sometimes to ask about a book I had been reading, sometimes just to sit quietly in the living room while I scribbled in my journal. He didn't hover. He didn't ask for gratitude or obedience. He simply let me exist, and in that quiet patience, I began to understand what family could feel like without being suffocating. For the first time, I felt like someone saw me. Not the middle child, not the shadow, not the forgotten one, but me. And yet, the past was never far behind. Memories of my parents' note and the cruel absence it signified still came unbidden. Jasmine's Instagram posts, Lily's cheerful emojis, even their names whispered in my head at odd times, reminding me I had been left behind. I didn't know whether to feel anger, sadness, or numbness, so I carried them all. A heavy pack I hid in my backpack at night. Uncle Richard noticed. Of course, not in a confrontational way, but in quiet gestures. He would leave a blanket on my bed, refill my water glass, or offer a word of encouragement at the breakfast table. Small things. But in a life where I had learned to expect nothing, they felt monumental. One night, after a long day at school, I sat on the porch watching the city lights flicker below. Uncle Richard came out, coffee in hand, and sat beside me without a word. For a long while we just watched, two figures in silence. Finally, he said, "You're doing fine. Clark, better than fine. Actually." That was the first time I felt like maybe the gap between the boy I had been and the person I could become wasn't as impossible as it had seemed. The house, the routine, the quiet patience of a man who had chosen me, these things were building me back up in ways I hadn't realized I needed weeks past. And life with Uncle Richard began to feel normal in ways I hadn't thought possible. Normal, yet tinged with a strange dissonance, like walking on polished marble while your bare feet still remembered the cold concrete of neglect. I started noticing the details, the way the light bent through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the faint hum of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the careful organization of his study that made even chaos look intentional. It was a world I hadn't earned, a world I wasn't sure I deserved, and yet Uncle Richard treated me as though I belonged. That was the hardest thing to accept. School continued to be a battlefield, only quieter. I made a few tentative friends, kids who didn't ask questions about my past or my parents' disappearance, but I stayed cautious. I had learned that trust was something you built slowly, brick by brick, and I wasn't about to hand it over carelessly. When I told Uncle Richard about small victories or minor embarrassments, he never dismissed them. Instead, he asked questions that made me think deeper, about my choices, my feelings, even the books I was reading. He had this way of making you feel capable without needing to say it outright. At home, I began exploring the house more freely. Each room had its own personality. The library smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. The kitchen always smelled faintly of fresh bread and coffee, even when no one was cooking. The garden outside my window became a refuge. I spent hours there after school, reading, thinking, or just staring at the sky as if memorizing. It could somehow stitch the holes left by my parents. Uncle Richard didn't intrude. Sometimes he'd join me, leaning against the porch rail, telling stories of his youth, his failures, the times he had to fight to get where he was. And in those stories, I began to see that even someone as controlled and wealthy as he could stumble, could struggle. That made the world feel a little less impossible, but the past always lingered. Jasmine and Lily's lives continued without me, their social media feeds a constant reminder of the family I had been abandoned by. I tried not to look, but curiosity clawed at me, and sometimes I slipped, scrolling just long enough to feel the old ache of being left behind. Uncle Richard never judged. Once, noticing my unease, he said quietly, "You can't fix them, Clark. All you can do is control what's in front of you." His words felt sharp but comforting, like a lifeline thrown in stormy waters. I realized he wasn't just giving me shelter. He was teaching me how to survive with dignity, how to stand tall even when the world had knocked me down. The first real challenge came one rainy afternoon. Uncle Richard asked me to help organize his study for a visiting client. I hesitated, nervous about touching anything of value in a world so far removed from mine. But as I worked, he watched silently, nodding occasionally. Afterward, he said, "See, you're capable. You just need to see it too." That small acknowledgement hit harder than I expected. I wasn't just the forgotten middle child anymore. I was someone who could contribute, someone who could be seen and relied on, not because of my parents' whim, but because of who I was becoming. Evenings became a quiet ritual. After dinner, we'd sometimes sit in the study, Uncle Richard working while I read or wrote. Other nights, he'd invite me to the living room, music playing softly, a game of chess set up between us. I realized I was learning more than just wealth or manners. I was learning patience, strategy, how to think ahead. Each day chipped away at the shadow the past had cast over me. And slowly, the fear that had clung to me since my parents left began to loosen, replaced by a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim my life in ways I never imagined. By the end of that month, I noticed a subtle change in myself. My confidence was no longer a mask. It was becoming part of who I was. I could hold my head high in the cafeteria, answer a question in class without fear, even smile at someone without flinching. The shadow of abandonment was still there, lurking in quiet corners of my mind, but it no longer dictated every thought or action. I began to see that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about learning to thrive in the space I had been given. One afternoon, Uncle Richard invited me to join him on a small errand in the city, a chance to experience the outside world of his wealth and influence in a controlled way. The streets buzzed with life, a chaotic pulse that felt both thrilling and alien. People glanced at us as we walked, some curious, others indifferent. I noticed my posture, the way I carried myself, and felt a flicker of pride. Uncle Richard had never forced me to look rich, but he had taught me something more important: presence. You don't need to prove yourself to the world if you know who you are. That knowledge gave me a strength that no cafeteria insult or whispered gossip could take away. Back at home, I started to take small risks. I spoke up more at school, joined a club, and even laughed more freely. Each victory, no matter how minor, chipped away at the insecurity that had defined me for so long. Uncle Richard noticed, but instead of praise, he offered guidance. "Confidence isn't loud," he said one evening. "It's steady. It's quiet control over yourself, not control over others. Remember that." I tucked his words away like a key to a door I hadn't yet unlocked. Evenings became a space for reflection. I would sit in the study, notebook open, scribbling observations about people, patterns, and my own reactions. Uncle Richard sometimes joined me, offering a story from his life or a question that made me think deeper. One night he leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said, "You've learned fast, Clark. But growth isn't just about strength. It's about knowing when to bend, when to retreat, and when to fight. Life will test you, and the tests you fail teach more than the ones you pass," I realized. Then that the house, the lessons, the trust he had given me, it wasn't about wealth. It was about shaping me into someone who could face the world, someone who could survive and eventually thrive. Of course, the past still intruded. Jasmine and Lily's posts, the occasional postcard from my parents, even memories of my old home sometimes hit like sudden storms. But now I had tools to weather them. I had Uncle Richard, who had chosen to invest in me when no one else would, and I had myself, slowly learning to navigate fear, anger, and loss without being crushed by them. By the end of those months, I began to feel a rare, almost alien sensation, a sense of belonging, not the hollow kind that comes from proximity or obligation, but the steady, grounding kind that comes from care, respect, and trust. Uncle Richard hadn't just given me a house. He had given me a foothold in life, a blueprint for strength, and the understanding that my past didn't define my future. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine that I could actually be happy, not just survive. Life with Uncle Richard had settled into a rhythm that felt safe, but safety, I was learning, often came with its own kind of pressure. The house, the lessons, the routines, they were a world apart from the one I had known, and every day reminded me how small mistakes could feel, monumental when you lived in privilege and power. One evening, while helping him sort through papers in his study, I stumbled across a stack of letters and documents that hinted at a life I had only glimpsed, through glimpses of cars, dinners, and whispered family gossip. Uncle Richard noticed me lingering over a ledger and didn't scold me for my curiosity. Instead, he said, "You'll learn everything in time. Some things are heavy, and you need to be ready for them when they arrive." His words carried weight. I realized that part of growing here wasn't just about adjusting, it was about understanding that wealth and influence came with responsibility, secrets, and burdens I hadn't anticipated. School continued to challenge me in ways I hadn't predicted. Rumors from classmates tried to find me, to poke at the fragility I had left behind. But I was sharper now, more deliberate. I had learned to read intentions before words were spoken, to notice the subtle shifts in posture, tone, and gaze. The notebook Uncle Richard had given me became my silent weapon, lists of observations, strategies for handling confrontation, and reminders of my own goals. I started applying these lessons cautiously, testing my own boundaries, experimenting with strength, patience, and diplomacy. Some days I failed. But I began to understand that failure wasn't a verdict, it was a lesson, a tool to sharpen resilience. Back at home, Uncle Richard's world slowly began to reveal itself to me piece by piece. I saw the careful orchestration of his life, the way he maintained control over every detail, not out of obsession but out of necessity. I watched him navigate phone calls with clients, manage appointments, and resolve conflicts with an ease that left me both in awe and slightly intimidated. One afternoon, while delivering some documents to him, I asked almost hesitantly, "Do you ever get tired of it all?" He looked at me, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Every day," he admitted, But being prepared, being aware, makes it manageable. That's why I'm teaching you not just to survive this house, but to survive life. I nodded, realizing that his mentorship wasn't about wealth. It was about preparation, foresight, and the ability to face challenges without being broken by them. At night, when the house fell silent, I would lie awake, thinking about the life I had left behind and the one I was slowly building here. The wounds from my parents' abandonment still throbbed occasionally, sharp and unpredictable, but I had learned to hold them at arm's length. Uncle Richard's presence was a steadying force, a reminder that trust, when earned, could be life-changing. I began to understand that loyalty, courage, and identity weren't just abstract ideas, they were skills, cultivated carefully over time, often under pressure, and tested in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The first major test of that understanding came unexpectedly. A distant relative, one I barely knew, reached out, their tone polite but with an undercurrent of judgment. They hinted at family grievances, wealth and unspoken rivalries, and I felt the old anxiety creeping in, the fear of being exposed as inadequate, of being treated as the forgotten middle child once more. But I remembered Uncle Richard's lessons. I listened carefully, observed the subtle cues in their behavior, and responded with calm, measured words. By the end of the conversation, I had deflected the hostility without confrontation and even earned a grudging respect. That night, I realized something profound. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning to navigate power, to stand in it and to carve out my own place in a world that had once seemed so inaccessible. The first crisp hints of autumn arrived. I felt like I had been reshaped, molded by circumstances I never would have chosen, but had survived nonetheless. The house no longer felt alien. It was mine in a sense I hadn't believed possible at 13. Uncle Richard's lessons, quiet guidance, and steady presence had given me more than safety. They had given me perspective, confidence, and the understanding that strength wasn't measured by loudness or wealth, but by endurance, awareness, and the ability to act with purpose. The real test came unexpectedly, in a way that reminded me just how intertwined life and challenge were. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the house, marked with the handwriting I recognized. Instantly, my mother's. She wrote as if nothing had happened, as if leaving me behind for years had been a trivial oversight. Reading it, my chest tightened with all the old, familiar ache, anger, sadness, betrayal. I wanted to crumple the paper, scream, make the world feel the absence she had inflicted on me. But then I felt something else, a steadiness in my chest that I hadn't felt before. I was no longer the boy trembling on the porch, abandoned and alone. I was Clark, someone who had survived neglect, learned to navigate complex power, and had been seen and valued for the first time in years. I carried the letter to Uncle Richard, expecting judgment or at least a lecture, but he didn't react the way I feared. He simply put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You get to choose what matters. Clark, some bridges you build, some you leave behind. This one, it's up to you." His words hit harder than any punishment or praise ever could. I realized then that the ultimate lesson of my life here wasn't about wealth, protection, or strategy. It was about choice. I could let the past control me, or I could define my own path. That night I sat in my room, the leather-bound notebook open in front of me. I wrote for hours, pouring out anger, fear, hope, and determination. Each word felt like a release, a reclaiming of my story. I reflected on how far I had come, from the boy left on the porch, clutching a backpack and a sense of worthlessness, to someone capable of navigating complex social worlds, standing firm in adversity and even forgiving, not because it erased the past, but because it allowed me to move forward. In the weeks that followed, I began taking small, deliberate steps into the world outside Uncle Richard's protection. I engaged more at school, joined clubs, and even started mentoring younger students who seemed lost, reminding myself of the boy I had once been. Each interaction was a quiet victory, a chance to turn pain into purpose. Uncle Richard watched from a distance, letting me stumble and rise, his guidance subtle but unwavering. He never demanded perfection. He simply expected growth, patience, and self-respect, and then came a family reunion, one that my parents insisted I attend. I felt a flicker of fear at first, the old instincts that had kept me small resurfacing, but I remembered Uncle Richard's lessons, the months of preparation, and the quiet power I had been building. I walked in not as a frightened child, not as the forgotten middle child, but as Clark, composed, confident and unshakable. Faces turned, whispers began, but I didn't flinch. I listened, I observed, I spoke only when it mattered. And for the first time I realized that the weight of abandonment no longer had the power to define me. By the end of the evening, my parents' surprise was palpable. They had expected the same timid boy they had left behind. But I had changed. I had grown. I had been seen, mentored, and forged in a life that demanded resilience. Walking away from the gathering, I felt a strange lightness, a sense of ownership over my own story. The years of neglect, the hunger, the fear, they had shaped me. But they no longer chained me. I had been abandoned, yes, but I had also been chosen by Uncle Richard, by life, and ultimately by myself. Lying in my bed that night, I looked out the window at the garden below, illuminated by the soft glow of autumn streetlights. The house, once intimidating and foreign, felt like home. Uncle Richard's steady presence, the lessons he had imparted, and the challenges I had faced had transformed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I had survived neglect, navigated privilege, confronted fear, and claimed my identity. And for the first time in my life, I slept knowing that my story was mine to write, and that the future, uncertain, vast, and full of possibility, was finally something I could face with open eyes.